The Mavericks beat the Thunder 117 to 116. It was a great game, came down to the wire. I think a lot of people really enjoyed this series. So, what's your reaction to game six, and how did you see this series as a whole?
Yeah, I thought this was a great series. I think one, it was very impressive from the Oklahoma City Thunder being so young that they were able to even really compete and put the kind of pressure that they were able to put on the Dallas Mavericks this whole series. But once the Mavericks kind of got that kind of feel and were able to get everybody involved and figure out ways that they could affect the game, I think that's when you really saw the Mavericks be able to kind of take control of the series. And I think it's very important to state that the two stars for the Mavericks didn't have a great game every series, but I think somebody was always able to pick up the slack and be able to help give the Mavericks the juice that they needed to win these games, starting in game two, being able to grab that one on the road and then take it on home and close out that game. The Mavericks kind of let game four slip away at home. It was kind of a weird kind of situation where all the main guys were pretty much struggling through the game. You had Luka, who wasn't having his best game. Kyrie was in an unusual offensive slump that game. And Shea broke out at the end of that game and was able to really put his team over the top. And he had some very bright spots in this series. But once you got down to the stretch and once the Mavericks were able to kind of set in, I think that the role players really stepped up. You look at guys like Derek Lively and just how big it was able to get him in the draft and how he was able to really affect the game. Luka and Kyrie were able to get that lob off to both of their bigs, and they were able to show that they could contribute offensively, give them kind of a relief point because you know that there was so much pressure and so much focus on those guys. Once they were able to get those paint touches, Luka especially was able to really be a playmaker from that area as well. So I just think they had a lot of contribution from guys, Daniel Gafford and Derek Lively and Derek Jones and PJ Washington, and obviously with him hitting those game winning free throws. If you think about how the Mavericks were at the end of last year and how many athletes they were able to add to this squad, I think it was able to kind of cover up those holes that they were missing and what they lost in that Kyrie trade, where, obviously those two guys aren't known as defenders, but even they stepped up on their defensive end throughout these playoffs. And I think it was just a lot of really good complementary pieces to add around those guys and for them to be able to step up, hit big shots, and play defense and compete on both ends of the floor. I think that was big time. And the experience and just the ability to kind of come through in the clutch is really kind of what separated them in this series and allowed them to close it out against the Thunder.
Yeah, it was just a total team effort from the Mavericks. And I think that that was just the difference in this whole series because when you look at it, the Mavericks got a lot of contribution from their other guys outside of Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving. Like you mentioned, Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving didn't have the best offensive series in terms of shooting and percentage wise, but I think that they did a great job as offensive initiators. And once the Thunder collapsed on Kyrie or Luka, when they got into the paint, they were able to distribute the basketball. And the other guys like PJ Washington, Derrick Jones Jr., Derek Lively, Daniel Gafford, Josh Green, all those players, they just took advantage of their opportunities and they were really efficient from not only shooting from the outside, but finishing those lobs from Luka or Kyrie. I mean, I can't even tell you how many lobs that Luka and Kyrie threw to Derek Lively and Daniel Gafford or just dump offs in the paint. And also, I really like how a lot of times when Luka would come off the screen, right, he would come off of the screen going to the wing position, right? And it would be either Gafford or Derek Lively setting the screen, and they would have Derrick Jones Jr. in the corner, right, in that same side corner. And every time Luka would come off of it, the weak side would get occupied because you have Lively or Gafford rolling to the basket, right? But the strong side corner defender would have his eyes on Luka, and Derrick Jones would just cut back
Right
door,
behind them.
and it would just be that baseline lob
Yep.
and dunk, and that was great. They hit on that multiple times throughout the series, and that was the difference in terms of it was just a total team effort, and many players contributed throughout the series because the Thunder they tried to make it very difficult for Luka and Kyrie, and they showed a lot of bodies when they came off of screens or got into the paint, trying to make them play in a crowd. And the reason I think that was such a big difference for the Dallas Mavericks in their favor is because the Dallas Mavericks did the same thing to Shea on the other side. They made Shea play in a crowd. They made him see a lot of bodies. They switched matchups on him multiple times, but whenever he would drive, it would just be a lot of help and just packing the paint. It almost seemed like the Dallas Mavericks played something like a zone in some ways, where it was like a 3-2 zone. It wasn't a zone necessarily, but just
Kind of
packing the
fit that
paint.
way.
Yeah, it kind of looked like it at times, especially when Shea would get into the paint. And
Mhm.
what would happen is Shea would have to kick the ball out to somebody or pass it, and the Thunder players just weren't as consistent, or they just weren't consistent enough to win games. There would just be times where they would just go cold, missing wide open jump shots, missing wide open opportunities. And the Dallas Mavericks just did not miss on as many of them. They took advantage of more opportunities that they got than the Thunder did. So I think that was the difference in the game. Shout out to Shea because I think he did a great job handling it, though. I mean, instead of getting all the way to the rim, most of the times he went to that
Yeah,
pull
lethal
up
through that
game
mid.
and mid
Yeah.
range jumper. Yeah. So his ability to stop and start and his change of pace, creating the space and figuring out how to combat what the Dallas Mavericks were doing to them, I think that was just great. And I mean, he basically won them multiple games throughout this series just off of that alone. I think game 4 was a perfect example of it. I actually think game 6 was a really good example of it too. It just didn't, turn out in a win.
Result.
But
Mhm.
I mean, I can't say enough about the job that Shea has done and actually the job that the Thunder have done throughout this whole season. But I just think the Mavs, from a total team perspective, they just played better and more consistent throughout the series than the Thunder did as a whole.
Yeah, and that was always my concern with the Thunder as far as the playoff setting, and them getting that same production that they got because it was a lot of Shea and depending on how well he played. So the fact that you're mentioning the other guys, you have your J Dub and he had some very bright spots in this playoffs and Chet came through and being able to stretch the floor. He actually got a lot of lives from those guys himself. Lou
Yeah.
Dort, he was in foul trouble, a lot of calls that could have gone either way. So he wasn't able to be out there and affect the game as much as he would have liked to, as far as minute wise. And Josh Giddey wasn't even really able to be on the floor in 5 minutes. And you saw a lot of those minutes going to Casey Wallace or Aaron Wiggins and guys like those. And, you have that big wing and playmaking ability and what Josh Giddey brings you, which could have possibly helped you on the offensive end, but just, his inability to stretch the floor at times and things like that. He wasn't really able to be out there and it just kind of fell into Shea's lap. And as far as responsibility, then after him, you're asking like J Dub to come in and provide those things for you. So as far as the playoffs, I just always had questions about if it's not Shea, then who else? And even with his great performances, as you mentioned, not all of them came out to be W's.